This is the place, the making of modern Mormon myth. Constructing a railroad through the Rocky Mountains was an imposing task, to be sure, but building on solid ground and blasting with dynamite where necessary made the project manageable. One natural feature that did not have a simple compromise, however, was the Great Salt Lake, which lay directly in the path of the preferred route. One way or another, the railroad would have to go around it. Given the remote geographical location of this massive body of water, U.S. officials in that day knew little about the surrounding terrain. Sending people to scout the Great Basin and the lake would be one of the first tasks needed to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. Shortly after the Mormons' arrival, the U.S. government funded another expedition. In 1849, the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, led by Captain Howard Stansbury, left Fort Leavenworth specifically to survey the Salt Lake and to evaluate existing emigration routes, including the Mormon Trail. Upon arriving in the Utah Territory, Stansbury met with Brigham Young and they discussed this assignment. After finishing his work in Utah, Stansbury headed back to Fort Leavenworth. Instead of following the Oregon Trail for the return trip, he decided to scout a more direct route east and recruited Jim Bridger for advice. His newly found path would eventually become the route used for the railroad, and later Interstate Highway 80. Stansbury said of this discovery, "It's very gratifying to be able to state that these results are in a high degree satisfactory, more so indeed than I had anticipated. It has been ascertained that a practicable route exists through the chain of the Rocky Mountains at a point 60 miles south of that now generally pursued, and in a course as much more direct as the chord of an arc is than the arc itself." Stansbury's explanation of a more direct route through the Rocky Mountains south of existing trails, in context of his job description, sheds a great deal of light on Brigham Young's plans and interest in finding the most southern route to the Salt Lake possible. In the following years, Brigham Young was anxiously seeking work projects for his people, especially something that would give them some cash payment. He jumped at the chance to take subcontracts on the two railroads, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, to give his people some work and money. The Mormons had, in fact, helped prepare the roadbed for the Pacific Railroad. In 1856, Congress had appropriated funds for improvement of the Oxbow, Santa Fe, and California Mormon trails, and Frederick Lander was appointed chief engineer and field superintendent for improvement of the California Mormon Trail, the very road that Union Pacific later built upon in large part. In 1858, shortly after the arrival of Johnston's army in Salt Lake Valley, Lander wrote a report to Washington expressing his appreciation for the help he had received from the Mormons in the road improvement project. 4 years later, and still long before the railroad was completed, Brigham Young and the Mormons participated in transactions related to the project. In November 1862, the New York Times reports, "Brigham Young yesterday opened books for subscription to the capital stock of the Union Pacific Railroad Company. He hopes that all who feel able to take shares in the stock of a company engaging in so great and useful an undertaking, and one so highly beneficial to our isolated territory, will promptly avail themselves of the opportunity for so doing." It should be noted the Union Pacific Railroad was first charted by the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, but did not actually begin operation until October 29, 1863, when the company was officially organized in Boston. Further evidence that Brigham Young's initial pioneer expedition was contracted by the government is the disputed American flag narratives. Supposedly, the company carried a flag into the Salt Lake Valley and claimed the region for the United States, which, if the stories are true, would indeed be odd behavior for a group that had been constantly harassed by the American government and were now attempting to leave the country. On Monday the 26th, President Young and several brethren ascended the summit of a mountain on the north, which they named Ensign Peak, a name which it has borne ever since. Elder Woodruff was the first to gain the summit of the peak. Here they unfurled the American flag, the ensign of liberty to the world. It will be remembered that the country then occupied by the Saints was Mexican soil, and was being taken possession of by the Mormon battalion and pioneers as a future great commonwealth to the credit and honor of the United States. Another account, the pioneers were reported to have made the following proclamation as they arrived atop Ensign Peak. In raising the flag upon this mountain, we name Ensign Peak. We take possession of this valley and of all the mountains, lakes, rivers, forests, and deserts of this territory in the name of the United States of America, and proclaim this land to be the American territory. Many historians, including those who recorded the preceding statements, have doubted these specific events ever occurred. Some of the depictions of the event include a different flag that the Mormons themselves created, while other narratives describe a yellow bandana that one of the apostles carried with him. Others yet say that there was no flag at all, but rather the men atop the peak commented that it would be an ideal location to raise an ensign. Due to the varying and contradictory nature of all these accounts, it's almost impossible to know for certain what happened on Ensign Peak that day. According to the church's history library, besides Young's group and the Mormon battalion, fewer than 1,700 pioneers, roughly 10% of those stationed at winter quarters, made the journey to Utah in 1847. This later collective consisted of 11 individual companies, most of them similar to the size of the first party, which did not depart from winter quarters until late June. It's these other 1847 companies that tell the real story of what Brigham Young was thinking when he began the journey westward. These groups were primarily small families, parents in their late 20s to early 40s with adolescent children, and almost no senior citizens or infants. Groups who could move efficiently at a moment's notice and were physically capable of handling frontier-type labor. By comparison, Young led another group the following year which had over 1,000 members. Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards also led companies in 1848 that had around 600 members each. Certainly, when Young knew he had found the right place, he would want a few of his more efficient followers to arrive soon after, to prepare settlements for others who would arrive later. But if Young already knew that Salt Lake Valley was the right place before arriving in 1847, why then would he make the next groups wait more than 2 months before beginning their journey? By embarking in June, the trailing companies would have arrived at the front range of the Rocky Mountains by the time the advance party had descended into the Salt Lake Valley. Then, if Young decided Utah was the place for his little kingdom, they would be close enough to finish the trip themselves before the first winter storms blew in. By that time, these groups would also have been far enough out that, if Young was not pleased with his appraisal of the valley, they could be intercepted and either turn back to winter quarters or adjust course to follow a contingency route toward Oregon or another potential destination. In effect, Brigham Young was hedging his bets. He did not yet know.